Okay, today's sponsor of our learning is Jerry and Sora Wolasky. It's in the zechus of refuah sheleimah for Zecharya Dov, ben Perel Shira, refuah sheleimah. And we do thank you for the sponsorship. Daf Hey, does that sound right? Yep. Here, more or less. Did you start the shtar? In other words, we had our Mishnah. And the Mishnah mentions that... Oh, so you have a little bit of Dalet Amud Beis to do? What was that? Okay. So so we're going to start from Dalet Amud Beis. What is it about? 11 lines from the bottom about? Of Allah. In other words, the Mishnah mentions 3 ways that you acquire. Kesef, Bia, and then we have Shtar. So now what's happening is that we're going to find a source in the text of the Torah itself for Bia, which is the sexual relationship that brings about the kinyan, that makes the wife. What's fascinating is that this approach, which is for step 1, for the erusin, they're not husband and wife yet, and technically speaking, it could be done through Bia. And obviously it's something that the rabbis did not approve of, but technically does work. What's the source for it? Milamed, it teaches us, sheniknes bevia, that she's acquired through the relationship itself. Now, this is the traditional analysis that's going to take place, where when a verse is mentioned as a source, the Gemara wonders, wait a second, do I really need a verse for it? Perhaps it could be derived from somewhere else. So therefore, here comes the question, Valodinu, it's something that can be learned from a Kal Vachomer. Uma Yevama, when it comes to a Yevama, a woman losing a husband without children, she enters into a marriage with the brother. How is that marriage, how is that relationship achieved? Through Bia. She'en niknes bekesef, indicating the kesef is the weaker one, because if he gives her the money, it won't work. It has to be through Bia. So Yevama, where kesef does not work, nevertheless, niknes bevia, Bia works, indicating it's stronger. So zu sheniknes bekesef. So if so, a regular woman, which we have already a source for the fact that she's acquired through kesef, right, the money that's given, eino din sheniknes bebia, how much more so? There shouldn't be a question, why do we need a source? So the Gemara is going to say, you know what, I'll show you that actually kesef is stronger, and therefore, let's look at the Jewish maidservant. How is she acquired with kesef? So therefore, Bia is weaker. Once it's weaker, right, and therefore once we know that there's a situation where Bia doesn't work, you're going to need a source in the Torah. Well, it's a different ballgame there, because the relationship there is not a relationship of marriage. It's a relationship where she basically works for the individual. Toimar bezu, on the other hand, when it comes to our discussion here, when it comes to the wife and the Yevama, shekinyana l'shum ishus. So therefore, on the surface, we do have here a Kal Vachomer. Nevertheless, we're told, and we're going to have to find the flaw in this Kal Vachomer, Talmud Lomar, the Torah teaches us, Uba'alo, there is a verse. And the Gemara asks, wait a second, you just told me that there is a way of learning it from a Kal Vachomer. Why do you need a verse? We just had a way of learning it. You could derive it from a Yevama. Comes Rav Ashi and he clarifies, Rav Ashi mishum de'ika lemeimar, right? That what you could say, that if you look at the beginning, if you look at the source of your Kal Vachomer, there's a weakness there. Me'ikora dedina percha. From where you are trying to derive it, there's a weakness. What's the weakness? What brings it apart? What makes it crumble? Where do you want to derive? You want to go ahead and say, hey, we find that Bia, right, Bia, which works by Yevama, right, Kesef won't work there, right? Bia does, indicating that if in a situation where Kesef does work, how much more so should Bia work? No, you can't learn from a Yevama. There's a link already. Remember from Yibum, there's talking about Zika. There's a link between the two. So therefore it's logical that a woman, as she enters into the relationship with the Yavam, bingo, there's a complete relationship there. Because there's a Zika, there's a link already. Toimar Bezu, on the other hand, when we're dealing with a regular situation of a woman and a man, so you can't derive it from Yibum. So therefore, you only way to know that Bia, indeed, is one of the three kinyonim, Talmud Lomar, Uva'alo. Now today's daf, Uminayin Shaf Bishtar. How do you know that a document works? What kind of document would it be that brings about Erusin or Kiddushin? The document would say, Hareat Mekudeshes Li. It's a document. The document, by the way, could have zero value, because if it's a Shava Pruta, well, he's giving her something that has value. It could work B'Torah Shve Kesef, it could work like Kesef. Shtar, what's the source for it? Here we go. Vidinu, well, we could start off with the Kal Vachomer. Uma Kesef, let's look at Kesef. She'en Motzi, right? Kesef itself. If the husband will go ahead and give her during the as a form of divorce, Kesef, it doesn't work. Ein Motzi. Nevertheless, they come into the relationship. Machni, so obviously we have a source that Kesef works to bring about a marriage. So Shtar, right? Shtar, which is stronger. Shemotzi, it does work, and that's the only way that you have a divorce with a get. How much more so? Enodin Shemachnis. Okay, that's the first attempt here. Well, Mahle Kesef. Well, Kesef actually, there's a reason to believe that Kesef works because Kesef is stronger. How do we find? Because it works in other areas. And what areas does Kesef work? If you want to go ahead and redeem, we do know that if you have an item that's sanctified, you could transfer its sanctity to money. That works. So too, Meiser Sheni, you have the second tithe, you have to bring it up to your sheleimah. It's impossible to bring up such a great amount. If you are blessed, you could transfer his sanctity to money. That works with Kesef. It doesn't work with Shtar. Now, what would a Shtar be for Hekdesh and Meiser Sheni? So Rashi understands this to mean some kind of document that you claim that you owe the money. Others have some difficulty with it. Some say perhaps it means a document that just says it is podui. But what we do know for a fact is that a shtar does not work for hekdesh. A shtar does not work for meiser sheni. So toimar b'shtar, shtar she'ein podim bo hekdesh u'meiser sheni. And how do you know? Maybe it does. Because the verse says v'nosan hakesef v'kam. Lo, the Torah tells us straight out that if you want to go ahead and redeem, right, a field or that has been sanctified, you give kesef, become lo, and then it's complete. On the other hand, the document is excluded from it. So if so, what we are stating now is the following. You want to tell me that, the document works in so many different places. It works in a divorce, even when money doesn't. So for sure, entering into the marriage, the Kiddushin, now that we know that money works, for sure the shtar should work. We'll say, no, actually, Kesef is stronger. It makes more sense that Kesef would work in shtar, not because Kesef works even for pidyon. Omar Kro. So therefore, the Torah tells us, actually, the source is the verse in Dvarim, where we are taught so many laws regarding divorce and marriage. There is a link, because we are told there's a woman, she's married, she gets divorced, v'yotza, yetzia, she exits the marriage, v'hoisa, and then she marries another man. And the rabbis had a tradition that there's a comparison, there's a link between the yetzia and the entry into a new marriage, which is known as, quoted often, v'yotza v'hoisa. Okay? So there's a comparison between the departure from a marriage and entering into a marriage, and the rabbis have a tradition that there's information, and some things that apply to one can apply to the other. Mekish, it's a hekesh, a comparison. Havaya leyetzia. The entry is going to be compared to the departure. Ma yetzia bishtar, just as a marriage comes to an end with a document, the get. So here's our source. Okay? It's derived from a get. Well, Gemara says, well, if so, if you have such a tradition to link the two, let's go the other way, the other direction as well. Let's say that just as when they enter into a marriage, their money is a function that would work. The kesef would work as a function as entering into a marriage. So too, right, when a marriage comes to an end, right, it could be achieved and it could take place by a form of money. Maybe that should be the case. Omer Rabbi says, you know what, it would be a problem with it. Why? Yomru. To go ahead and claim that kesef machnis, that kesef brings her in them into the relationship. Kesef motzi, there's a problem there. What's the problem? Sanegor yase kategor. Sanegor, right? A defendant does not turn into a prosecutor. Fascinating term. But the idea is that money is to bring them close together. That's what the marriage is all about. For it to turn around and be the mechanism for a divorce doesn't make sense. Don't get me wrong, there's obviously a lot of money in the divorce, the lawyer fees, but it can be that which achieves the gerushin. It has to be a document. Well, the Gemara says, wait a second, if you're uncomfortable with this concept, and therefore that's how you read the verse, if so you could claim, how can they enter into a marriage with a document, right? That's so unromantic, because we do know that when you see a document handed from husband to wife, what do you think immediately? A get. And if so, make the same claim that the kategor, the prosecutor, Ya'aseh Sanegor, could turn into a defendant. The Gemara says, you know what? There's a difference there, because look at the document. The document and its wording determines or really defines what this is all about. So therefore, the mili, the words, the hayshtar alachud, the words of this document are different. Mili, the hayshtar alachud. In other words, we don't have that discomfort because the wording in each document indicates that they are very, very different. The wording in the document of the divorce are a separation, where the relationship is severed, and here they are coming together, and therefore we have no problem of using v'yotza v'haisa to teach us that they can enter into a marriage with a document. Well, Gemara says, if so, why don't you just say that each money is different? One's a money of detachment, and one's money that's handed to connect them. Claim the same. The Gemara says, no. Tiva mi'ah chadhu, it's one coin, it's the same currency. In other words, the essence of a document is what's written in the document. If they are different, they are two different entities. Here it's the exact same money. Rava Omar, Rabbi tells you, you know how you know that kesef would not work to put an end to the marriage? It's not a function. Now, by the way, we do find, right, that when it comes to a slave, he gives money, he could go ahead and buy back his freedom. One would think so, but Rabbi says no. Omar Krove Kosavlo. If you look at the language of the Torah makes it very, very clear. And again, they had a tradition that what's being taught here is V'Kosavlo. Beksivo misgareshes veno misgareshes bekesef. How does the marriage come to an end? With something that is written. Now, the Gemara says, wait a second. If so, why don't you say, if you're telling me that the Torah is telling us that through writing there is divorce, so perhaps claim that what we're being told is that when it comes to divorce, a document works. Ve'ema, Rav, I can ask you, beksiva miskareshes. Maybe we are being told that a writing, a document works when there is a gerushin, ve'eno miskadeshes beksiva. So in other words, if you're presenting this verse, v'kosavlo, perhaps it's telling us that only here in a divorce a document could work, but not into a marriage. The Gemara says, no, you can't say so, because we have another source, haksiv, that there is a comparison, v'yotza v'haisa, mekish, and therefore, so it appears that we have here is one source that tells us there's something particular about divorce, and one's telling us that you indeed could link the marriage to divorce. Now, Umara Isa, what's the logic? In other words, why are you telling me that Vikos Savlo is telling us that a divorce can only take place with a document, and V'yotza v'haisa is telling me that they could enter into a marriage with a document? Well, perhaps look at it differently. Maybe say that V'yotza v'haisa is to teach you that money works as a mechanism of divorce, and the Kosa law is telling me that they can't enter into a marriage with the document. So it says, Mistaber, it's logical to say that Kai Begerushin, if it's a verse that it appears in the context of Gerushin, Mimayed Gerushin, it's coming to limit something that relates to divorce, because it would not make sense to say Kai Begerushin, Mimayed Kiddushin. That doesn't make sense. Now, if you remember in Gittin, there was an opinion in Mishnah of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, and Rabbi Yossi Haglili says that the verse V'kos Savlo teaches us the following, that you should know that there are some items that you cannot use as a form of a bill of divorce. In other words, obviously, if you remember, we don't have to, it doesn't have to be written on parchment, right? It doesn't have to be written on paper. Technically, be written on, let's say, a stender, for example, the bill of divorce. But basically it says, but be sure that it's not on food, and be sure that it's not on a Baal Chai. You cannot go ahead and tattoo on a cow, right, a bill of divorce and hand it from husband to wife. That won't work because of the Kosav law. So that's what he uses this verse for. Now that creates a little bit of a problem for him here, because in other words, you're using this verse to teach me that from V'kosavlo, but Rabbi Yossi Haglili there in Gerish in Gittin uses it ledrosha achrino for what? As we mentioned, he uses it that it's to limit what types of items can be handed as a form of a bill of divorce. So if so, we can ask Rabbi Yossi Haglili, she'eino misgareshes bekesef minole. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, how do you know that kesef cannot be used as a form of severing the marriage? Omar Kro, he says the following, Sefer Krisus, right? And therefore, what the Torah is telling us, that it has to be a book of severance, of complete detachment. But what he's telling us is that we are being taught here, Sefer Korso, when something is written, that is a form, that's the mechanism of divorce. Ve'ein dovar acher korsa, nothing else. It has to be a sefer, a money is not safer. Now, obviously, as we find often in the Gemara, when one authority brings a verse to learn something and another authority doesn't need it, so we could ask him, okay, what do you do with that verse? What do the rabbis do with this krisus? It's needed, as we learned in Gittin, that ledovar hakores beino leveino. When, if let's say there's a stipulation, there's a t'nai in a get. In some cases it could disqualify a get, and in what case would that be? If it is something that never brings about a detachment from the two parties. And therefore, what they are deriving is, it has to be a Sefer Krisus, that within the bill of divorce, it has to be that the relationship comes to an end. What does that mean? Kidditanya, as we learned in the Brisa, Harei zegitech, if the husband hands the wife a bill of divorce, and he stipulates almenat, and there's a stipulation in the document shelo tishtayain almenat shelo telchi lebeis avich leolam, and some say that it's not lebeis avich or lebai zesh avich, that you never ever enter into this house, or that you never drink wine, then this is a valid bill of divorce. So we are told here that there's a problem here, because it comes out that for the rest of her life she's still connected, so it hasn't been severed, and therefore Sefer Krisus, it's a problem there. Okay, that's what he learns from Krisus. Ein ze Krisus. Now, if on the other hand there's a limit is a stipulation, and a stipulation does work. Kol shloshim yom, if it's only for 30 days, how is that Krisus? Now, so this is what the rabbis, right? This is what the rabbis learn from Sefer Krisus. While Rabbi Yossi Haglili needs it to teach us kesef not, the rabbis say it has to be a dover hakores beino lebeino. Now, what about Rabbi Yossi Haglili? He needs it as well. So he says, if you look carefully, it could have said Sefer Karet, a sever that severs. But the language is Kritut. So the double language, or the extra two letters, could teach us Rabbi Yossi Haglili Mekaris Krisus, bingo. So we have two things that could be derived here. That it's Dover HaKoros, that it has to be a bill of divorce that severs the relationship, and it has to be a sefer and not money. So here we go. Rabbi Yossi Haglili mekaris krisus kanafkale v'rabonon kores krisus lo mashma lahu. In other words, to go ahead and, if it's a form of speech, to go ahead and analyze the two extra letters, they don't work with that, and therefore for them only one thing is derived from it. Now, what the Gemara is going to do is the following. We have here our Mishnah, right? Haishaniknes, kesef, shtar, bia. We have verses for all three. But the Gemara is going to ask the question, wait a second, do you really need a verse for all three? Perhaps a verse for two would be required. The third one could be derived from the two. And this is something, an exercise that's common throughout the Gemara. The Gemara says, okay, you couldn't derive each one on its own, but now that you have three, and logically perhaps by not having a source for one, you could still learn it from the other two. So if so, ask the Gemara, okay, you can derive one from one. We went through the exercise, we have clarity with that. But Taisi, let's derive one from two. So here we're going to go, we roll up our sleeves, and we're going to have to look at every single one, at Kesef, Shtar, Bia, and say, okay, learn Kesef from Shtar or Bia, learn Shtar from Kesef or Bia. Okay, hi Taisi, well, what do you want to learn? Okay, make a suggestion. Lo lichtov Rachmana b'Shtar. The claim is, okay, you know what, the Torah shouldn't have written Shtar. V'Taisi mahanach, and derive from the two of them. In other words, just as we find, right, that a woman could enter into the relationship with Kesef or Bia, so it's logical to transfer it to Shtar as well, right? Malahanach, but these two are very, very different. You can't learn it from Bia and Kesef. Bia and Kesef, there's pleasure there. There's enjoyment. A document, there's no enjoyment there. It's just stating a fact. So therefore, you do need a verse for a document, because Malahanach, when it comes to Kesef and Bia, Shkin Hano Osam Meruba, there's pleasure involved when it comes to the relationship or when it comes to money. On the other hand, Shtar not. So therefore, obviously, the Torah we have to have a source for the shtar. Well, nichtov rachmana bevia. Well, the question is going to be, the Torah shouldn't mention bia, v'teisi mahanach, and derive it from kesef and shtar. No. Malahanach, these are very different. Sheken kinyan merube. In other words, we find that money as a form of a transaction works in many different scenarios, right? The whole financial market works by giving money, you acquire things. So too, when it comes to a document, you purchase land. So therefore, those two are a kinyan meruba. They work in many different circumstances. So it's logical that they work when it comes to the marriage. On the other hand, when it comes to bia, not. Now, and if your question is, lo nichtov rachmano bekesef v'teisi mahanach, and if you ask, okay, we shouldn't need a source in the text for kesef and derive it from shtar and bia. No, malahanach sheken yeshnon ba'al korcha. When it comes to bia, right, we know that the yibum is done even if against the will, and so too when it comes to a shtar, the bill of divorce, is valid even if it's against the will. On the other hand, money we find in general, it appears to be that money would only work if both parties are in agreement. So due to the fact that it's weaker, you can't derive it from those two. Now, and if you want to claim v'chitema kesef nami bal korcho ba'amo ha'ivriya, and if you claim, well, when you purchase the Jewish maidservant, money is given there and it's against the will. Well, when it comes to a relationship of issues of marriage, we do not find that we could have a transaction that is done against the will. Mia lo ashkachan, it's not to be found. Okay, so that's what we have up until this point, and now we have Rav Huna's statement. It was referred to earlier, and it's important to remember what Rav Huna tells us, because he throws in the fourth, not just kesef, not just shtar, not just bia, but something called chuppah. Now, it's fascinating that I think we're all familiar with the term chuppah, but rabbinic authorities throughout the ages always struggled, what exactly is a chuppah? Right? What is technically the chuppah? Chuppah kona. What is the chuppah? So although nowadays we say, yeah, when a chuppah, we're dealing here with the two posts and the canopy, but what is the chuppah? So some Rishonim say that it's the hinuma, it's the fact that the face is covered, that is the chuppah. Some say that it's bringing in the wife into the husband's domain, that's the chuppah. Whatever it is, we are familiar with the fact that in the two stages of marriage, that you first have the erusin, and then you have the nisuin that completes it. The nisuin is achieved with something called the chuppah. Comes Rav Huna and he claims, listen, Now that we know that, you should know that chuppah works to begin this relationship. In other words, as an erusin, as stage one, mikal v'chomer, and it could be derived from a kal v'chomer, because uma kesef. So there's going to be attempt one to analyze Rav Huna, which is not going to work. And then there's going to be number two, because he says the following. Uma kesef sheno machil betruma, when the man, the young man, walks over to the woman and gives her kesef and says, Harei at mekudesh asli, right? She doesn't start eating truma yet until she enters into his house. Nevertheless, right, so Kona, it acquires it, works as one of the three forms. Chuppah, which is stronger, because once there is chuppah, she enters into the husband's domain. Shema acheles b'truma. She could suddenly eat truma again. Obviously, if he's a Kohen. So we're talking about a situation. He's a Kohen. She's not a Bas Kohen. Her whole life she's been dreaming of eating truma. Okay, Hareyat Mekudesh Asli, she gets very, very excited. I'm married to a Kohen. But we say, wait, right? You have to wait until you enter into his domain until there's chuppah. So it comes out that chuppah is stronger, right? So if kesef, which doesn't work, how much more so should chuppah work? So what Rav Huna basically is arguing is that if he walks over to her and he does a chuppah, brings her into his domain or under the canopy, that's going to work for stage number one. So the Gemara says, wait a second, this doesn't work, because kesef actually does give her the right to eat truma. According to Torah law, if the Kohen walks over to the young lady and says, Hareyat mekudesh asli, she could eat truma. So therefore, the statement is simply not true. V'kesef eino machil. You're telling me kesef eino machil. V'omar ula ta dvar Torah. According to Torah, la arusa bas Yisrael. If she's arusa, she only had the erusin, and she's the daughter of Israel. Ocheles betruma, because the Torah says shenemar. The verse tells us in the Torah, v'kohen ki yikne nefesh kinyan kaspo. In other words, included in those things that he acquires, that gives a green light for the acquired entity to eat truma, is something acquired with kesef, and that's obviously could be referring to the isha arusa v'kinyan kaspo. Now, why is it so that we do know that in general a woman, when she is in the stage of erusin, does not eat truma? Uma ta'am omru eino ocheles. And what's the reason that she doesn't? So there's a concern here, because when she's in arusa, she's still living by her father. And let's say the lovely chassan, right, just got a good batch of high-end truma wine, right? And he gets it, and he looks at it, and he says, oh, this is magnificent. You know what? I'm going to be a good chassan. I'm going to send some to my kala. So he bottles it, sends it to the kala. The kala gets it. She's been dreaming. She gets the truma in her father's house, and maybe for the first few minutes she says, only I could eat it, but after 12 ounces, she says, maybe others could eat it as well. So there's a little bit of a concern, and therefore the rabbis made a decree, no truma for you, right? You don't get any, right? Because there is a gzeira, it's a decree, a logical one. Shemayim zegulakos bevesavia. They're going to pour a glass of wine for her in her father's house. V'tashken alach yalach yosean. She's going to give it to her siblings. So therefore, now that we know that according to Torah law, Kesef does give her the right to eat truma, Rav Huna's kal v'chomer doesn't make sense anymore. Right? Rav Huna says, chuppah is stronger because chuppah gives her the right to eat truma. Kesef not. Kesef does, Rav Huna. So therefore, we're going to have to amend a little bit the words of Rav Huna. Ela parichachi. This is actually the question. Uma kesef she'ena gomer. In other words, when the money is handed from the young man to the lady, it does not make her a complete wife, because if she works, the earnings still belong to the father. He cannot inherit her yet. So therefore, it's not gomer. It is not complete. Nevertheless, even though it's not gomer, what happens is kona. It works at stage number one. So chuppah shegomeres, when it comes to chuppah, which completes it, enodin shetikne. So for sure, it should make a kinyan. That's what Rav Huna argues. Now, malek kesef, come on, there's a difference there, because kesef is much stronger. Sheken podim bo hegdeshus u'maiser sheni. Okay, so you're telling me that chuppah works because if kesef, the weaker one, works, for sure chuppah. Well, no, kesef is very strong, because kesef could be used for redemption of items that have been sanctified, a Ma'aser Sheni. So the Gemara says, no, well, Bia Tochiach, I'm going to prove it from Bia, because Bia doesn't work, obviously, for a redemption, and it does achieve Erusin, so therefore, Ravuna is going to argue Chuppah as well. Well, Mala Bia Shekin Kona Bia Vama, well, it could be that the reason Bia works as Erusin is because it's stronger, it works by Yavama. Well, Kesef Yochiach, Kesef doesn't work. Therefore, Chazar Adin, you look at the common denominator. Lora Izeh Kira Izeh, each one has a strong point, each one has its weak point. The Lora Izeh Kira Izeh, but nevertheless, Hatzar HaShovesh Ben, what's the common denominator of Kesef and Bia? That they Shekonin Be'alma, that they are tools of acquisition that work in other places. The Konin kind of work here. So too, argues Rav Huna, Afani Avi Chuppah. It's logical for me to believe that so too when it comes to Chuppah, it works in other scenarios. It works as an Isui, and therefore it's logical that it should work as in Erusin. Afani Chuppah, Shekona Ba'alma B'kona Kan. So the Gemara says, well, truth is there's a difference, because Malatzara Shovesh Ben, when it comes to Bia and it comes to Kesef, there's pleasure there, and therefore it makes sense that it should achieve Erusin. So they have a common denominator. Sheken Hana Osa Maruba, there's a lot of pleasure there. Well, I'll tell you that, don't tell me that the reason something works for Erusin is because there's pleasure. You know why? Because there's a third one. Which one? Shtar Yochiach. Well, Malishtar, shtar is different, that perhaps the shtar works for Erusin, that the document works for Erusin because it has a strong point that it works as a form of divorce. Can motzi b'bas Yisrael. Well, look at the other two that don't work for Gerushin. Kesef u'bia yochichu. V'chazar hadin. So therefore you will turn around in circles, but the bottom line is that each one has its uniqueness. Lo re'izeh kere'izeh. This one is not like this one. V'lo re'izeh kere'izeh. And the other one is not like the other one. Bottom line is, what's the common denominator, says Rav Huna? Hatzar hashavet shubahan. Shekonim, that they work to acquire. Ba'alma, in other environments. V'konim kan, and they work here. Afani avi chuppah, therefore I'm going to say that chuppah is the same. Shekone be'alma, that it works in other places. V'kone kan. Okay? Well, Rav Huna, we're going to still ask you that there's a difference. Malatzar hashovesh ben sheken yeshnon ba'al korcha. Okay? That it does work, right? Ba'al korcha, that you do have when it comes to all three, that there's Baal Korcha. Where is that? Bia. What does Bia work? Baal Korcha. Yavama. Shtar. Gerushin. Kesef. Ama Ha'ivriya. Right, when it comes to the Jewish maidservant. The money is done, it's not willingly, it's done even against her will. Rav Huna says, you know what? That's not a question. Because when it comes to the guidelines that are presented for issues when it comes to marriage, lo ashkachan ba'al korcha, there is no ba'al korcha when it comes to the topic of marriage. When it comes to kesef, there is no ba'al korcha. Therefore, Rav Huna is quite confident here that I could have number 4 on my list, right? Haisha niknes, right? Ba'arba drachim for Rav Huna, kesef, shtar, bia, and chuppah. Now Rava opens a Mishnah and says, wait a second. I find 2 problems here with Rav Huna's opinion. Now look at our Mishnah, 3, not 4. How do you throw chuppah into the mix there? Let's analyze it here. Chuppah works, yes, but it only works after you did something else. Chuppah gomer v'od, klum chuppah gomers. Yes, chuppah is strong, it works, right? It clinches it. But that's el al yedei kiddushin. That's only because there was kiddushin prior to it. V'chi gamrinan, you want to go ahead and derive chuppah shelo al yedei kiddushin. Then a chuppah without kiddushin works mechuppah shal yedei kiddushin. It makes no sense. The only reason it works is because it's a clincher, right? It's a closer. So because something is a closer doesn't mean it can pitch for all 8 innings, right? There's a big difference there. So Abaye comes and defends Rav Huna. Omar le Abaye. You know what, Rava? Well, I can tell you, Tana, the Mishnah mentions Milsa de Ksiva Behed Yoktani. Those things that are mentioned explicitly. That's what Abaye is arguing. Don't worry about the Mishnah, because when it comes to the 3 mentioned in the Mishnah, we have a source for it in the Torah. Perhaps you had a little bit of a discussion, the opinion of the Rambam, that the Rambam seems to write that Kesef only works Medivrei Sofrim. And there's a lot of discussion what exactly the Rambam means, but Ramban tells us, hey, this seems to make it very, very clear that Kesef is not Divrei Sofrim, it's in the Torah, because This is what Abaye is stating to defend Rav Huna, that the Mishnah mentions three, the three that are mentioned. But milsa deloksi ve'behedia, that which is not explicit but rather derived as Rav Huna derived from something else, lokatani. So therefore, question number one, Rava, we could deal with it. Question number two, well, if you think about it, v'tekomer, that's what you claim. Klum chupa gomeres, your claim was, wait a second, Rav Huna, chupa only could clinch it, el alidei kiddushin. Well, that exactly is what Rav Huna is saying. Rav Huna nami hachikomer. And what he's saying is the following. Uma kesef, when it comes to kesef, she'eno gomer achar kesef, kesef cannot be a closer after kesef, right? It's not one of the three that closes it. Nevertheless, Kone could start the process. So chupa shegomeres achar kesef. If it could be a clincher, which kesef cannot be a clincher, so how much more so enodin shetikne? So that's its claim, that since it could work, kesef cannot work after kesef as a clincher, right? Chuppah does. So therefore what he is arguing is that indicates that chuppah is stronger, and therefore it should have the ability to begin the process as well. Well, here we go. Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, so Ketzad bekesef. How does it work bekesef? What time do we end? Just 30. So, okay, we're still good? Tanu Rabbanon Ketzad bekesef. How does it work? What does he say? Nosala kesef or shve kesef. He could give her kesef or an item of value, like a very expensive ring. V'omar lo hareyad mekudeshes li. You are mekudeshes li. Today we add the words of what? Kedas Moshe ve'Yisrael, and it's very significant words that play a role in some situations. But the key words are harei at mekudeshes li. Or the other word that's used for a betrothed woman is harei at me'uresetli, harei at le'intu, le'isha, you are my wife, harei za mekudeshes. Now, what doesn't work? Now, there are two things that are taking place here. There's something that's being transferred from husband to wife, and there's something that's being uttered. Okay? Speech and that which is uttered. So now we're being told, aval hi shenosna. So the first part of this brisa tells us he has to give and he has to say. The second part tells us, aval hi shenosna, if she's the one that provided the item of value. V'amra hi, and then she said, hareini mekudeshes lecha. She's the one that stated, hareini me'ureses lecha, hareini lechalitu, eino mekudeshes. Now it's interesting because the first part here tells us that he has to do both the handing over and the statement must be made by him. And the second part tells us that if she does both, it's no good. What about if it's halfway? So here we have Rav Papa asking a question that it appears to be an actual contradiction here. Maskif Rav Papa, let's look at the first part here. TALMUD, the reason is denosanhu v'omarhu. That is, he was the one that gave, and he's the one that stated, indicating, hanosanu, if he gave v'omra he, and she is the one that uttered, Eino Mekudeshes, it doesn't work. That's very clear by analyzing the first part of this brisa. Maseva, look at the second half. Aval hi shenosna lo, if she gave ve'omra hi, lo have a Kiddushin. The second half seems to indicate that the issue is, taima dinosna hi ve'omra hi. That is because she is the one that also gave over and as also uttered the words hanosanu, indicating that if he gave it va'imrahi, then have a kiddushin. So how do we understand it? So therefore, what the Gemara is going to try to say is, listen, reisha dafka. The first part is really the statement that's principled and the way it works, that you need the husband, you need the male to do both. Seifa kedinas, but sometimes we find in brisos that they're going to mention something that's unnecessary, even if it could be derived from the first part. They're going to present the second half. Now, that doesn't work here, because that perhaps could work if the second statement is just additional information that could have been derived. But you cannot have a contradiction. And that's what's going to be asked now. Vitani Seifo, you're telling me that the second half of this brisa is presenting a milsa, this sosra l'reisha? You're telling me that it's presenting here information that contradicts? So therefore, we're going to have to analyze, and it's a brisa, so we have that flexibility that we're going to say the following. Elahochi komar, this is what the brisa is telling us. Nosanhu v'omarhu, if he is the one that gave and he is the one that said it, pshita, there's no question that have a kiddushin is kiddushin. If nosanhu v'omra he, if on the other one, she is the one that uttered the words. So we're going to say now, approach number one, na'aseh, it is comparable to kemi shenosna ve'omrahi. In other words, her utterance is worthless, and therefore it is as if she performed the whole act. Ve'lo have Kiddushin, it's not Kiddushin. That's approach number one. Approach number one, v'ba'isem, you can say nosanhu ve'omar hu, then clearly mekudeshes. If on the other hand, nosnahi, if she is the one that gave, va'omrahi eino mekudeshes. But if nosanhu va'omar rahi, here we have it, and this is something that's mentioned in halacha, sfeikohi, it's a doubt. In other words, we have to understand when there's a requirement for him to utter words, is it that the words accomplish things or they clarify things? If it's something that's accomplished by the husband uttering the words, so obviously just as he has to give, he has to say. But if it's only to clarify why, there could be scenarios that by she, if let's say they're discussing a marriage beforehand, and she says, hooray, I'm receiving this as Kiddushin, perhaps it could work, and therefore it's a sveikohi. V'chayshinon midrabanan, and we have to be concerned rabbinically. Okay, Omar Shmuel, comes Shmuel, and he says, when it comes to Kiddushin, nosan lo kesef v'shaveh kesef omar le harei at mekudeshes. You know what word is missing here in Shmuel's words? Harei at mekudeshes, without the li. So, there are indications here that he means mekudeshes li, but it's not mochiach, it's not clear. We're going to have to address that. Harei at meureshes, harei at lilin to harei za mekudeshes, indicating that even though that it's not mochiach, even though that it's not proven by his words, the circumstances are good enough to indicate what his intentions are. Okay? Now, if on the other hand, the language is simply that she is the one that's making the motion, Hareini Ishech, I'm turning into your husband, meaning not a Harat Mekudeshesli, where you could visualize it as the husband bringing the young lady close to him. But he's stating here that the result is, Hareini Ishech, I'm turning into your husband. In other words, you're the one you're standing in the same place, I'm the one that's becoming closer to you. Hareini Balech, Hareini Arisasech, Inkam Beis Michush, there's nothing to be choshesh, it's not considered valid. And so too, by the way, the language is necessary, as we know with Gerushin as well, V'chen beGerushin, Nosan Lavamar Lo Hareat Mishuleches, without li. Hare, you are sent away, Megureshes, you are divorced. Hareat Muteres L'chol Odom, Hare Megureshes, it works. But if the language is that he is detaching himself, he's making the motion and not pushing her away, Eini Ishech, I'm no longer your husband, Eini Balech, Eini Arusasech, Inkan Beis Michush, you don't have to be concerned yourself at all, it's nothing. Now, by saying that Shmuel doesn't need the li, that indicates that even if you have, this is a topic that you had in Nedarim and Nazir, Yodaim Shein Mochichos. In other words, circumstance indicate, but it's not very, very clear. Shmuel seems to be telling us that even though he does not utter the li, the circumstances, and even though it's not mochiach, even though it's not proven, nevertheless is valid. This seems to be telling us, the Sovar Shmuel, that Shmuel is of the opinion, Yodaim Shein Mochichos, Havi Yodaim, even if it's not mochiach, even without the li, it's considered a valid statement. But the problem is, Vatnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Ha'omer Harei Ze Noz Ehe. If a person says, I shall be, and we are told Harei Ze Nozir, it's considered a Nozir, and we wonder, wait a second. What do you tell me? How can you say that he's a Nozir? Maybe he means I shall be in a state of fasting. The Omer Shmuel clarified that the only time Ehe works is V'hu Shehoyo Nozir over Lefanov, indicating that if there's a Nozir passing in front of him, and it's Mochiach, that his intention is to be like that Nozir, then indeed he's a Nozir. Now, that seems to be telling us that Shmuel believed time of the Nozir over Lefanov. The reason it is the Ehe works is because there's a Nozir right there. Halavach, if not for that low, so if so, Yodaim Shein Mochichos, according to Shmuel, seems to be a problem. So the Gemara is going to have to adjust the statement of Shmuel. Hochum Maskin and the Omar Li. He did say Li. Well, if so, my Kamashmon, what's being taught here? So that's something we're going to have to see tomorrow. Everyone have a good Erev Shabbos. Very good.